turn in your Bible to the book of Leviticus. Covered chapter 17 last week in our study. There we found a statute making the tabernacle and later the temple the sole place of sacrifice for the nation of Israel. This applied to the Israelites as well as any strangers that were sojourning or dwelling among them. And breaking this commandment carried one of the most severe penalties under the law, which was to be cut off from the congregation of Israel, but also that would also include Israel's covenant with God. And so you lose a lot by disobeying God's commandment here. Chapter 17 also repeated a prohibition that had been mentioned earlier against eating blood, and spoke about how God himself would judge those who refused to follow that command or ignored it. As we come to chapter 18, the identification of unlawful practices continues by addressing inappropriate relationships. So Leviticus chapter 18, we'll start with verses 1 and 2. Here the Bible says, "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, I am the Lord your God." And so as we get into this part of the law that deals with the behavior of God's people, we see this phrase in verse 2 appears several times. It says, I am the Lord. And this is something that's repeated 6 times in this particular chapter and 39 times over the next 8 chapters after that. And so this is a key phrase where God is identifying who he is, and he's reminding them not only of who he is, but of the authority that he has. Up to this point, the instructions that have been given, the commandments that have been made, dealt with a lot of different things. It dealt with bringing sacrifices to God which were acceptable and those which weren't acceptable. It talked about the priesthood and the role that it played in performing those works and worship of God. It talked about uncleanness of various sorts, ceremonial uncleanness that had to be dealt with, and how to deal with all those things. And so all of these things are just kind of additions to the lives of these Israelites. Some of them were clarification on how they were to do things, like the offerings. They were probably offering sacrifices before this time, but this gave some details about how to go about that. Of course, it established the priesthood and all those things, but those are some additions. Now, we're getting into the place where God is really addressing the behavior of his people and is calling out some things that they may have been involved in, some things that they may have already been guilty of. And so we all know it's one thing to say, hey, I'd like you to worship in this way. And okay, well, we can get on board with that, and that's no problem. It's a complete different thing whenever it's you're doing wrong and you need to change it. Because these are things that were probably ingrained in their lives to different degrees based on, different things that are mentioned here. And so he really emphasizes this point that he is the Lord, that he has the authority to command these things, that he has the right to say this is right and this is wrong, and really establish those things. And that answers one of the questions that a lot of people have, right? If you say, hey, can you help out with this, that, or the other, people are fine with that. If you say you're doing wrong, the natural question is, well, who are you to tell me I'm wrong, right? Who are you? Well, God answers that question. I am the Lord. And that word Lord there is Jehovah. It's the name for God, the special name that Israel knew him by. It's reminding them, I have the right to do this. I have the right to tell you what's right and what's wrong. I have the right to establish these morals that you're going to live your life by. And so, like I said, we see it 6 times in this chapter alone, and more times after that in the following chapters, really throughout most of the rest of the book. It's a common theme because it's really at this point where he's telling them these are the ways you should live, these are the ways you should not live. And so that's really clarified and made a big point of throughout this passage. Verses 3 and 5 lay out some of the expectations, or begin the expectations that God has for his people. Verse 3, after the doings of the land of Egypt wherein ye dwell shall ye not do, and after the doings of the land of Canaan whither I bring you shall ye not do, neither shall ye walk in their ordinances. Ye shall do my judgments and keep mine ordinances, to walk therein. I am the Lord your God. Ye shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man do, he shall live in them. I am the Lord. So again, 2 more times he's repeated that same phrase, I am the Lord, reminding them who he is. And here he explains you aren't to live like the people around you, whether it's the people in your past in Egypt and the things that they were involved in, or the people in the place where you're going to in the land of Canaan. You aren't to be like other people. You are to be different. You are to follow my commandments. You're to heed my judgments and my statutes. You're to do what I say. And that will separate you. That will make you distinct. That will make you special among the nations of the earth. And so his expectation was that they would be different. Now again, I think this is something that's very pertinent to us today, because God has called us to be different. He's called us to not be like the world, to not live in the ways of the world, to not follow the direction that the world is going, but that we are to stand firm on the truth, that we are to follow God's commandments just like they were to. Now, we don't live under this law, okay? We understand that. But God has given us very clear instructions and very clear commandments about how we should live and how we should not live. And He expects us to live up to that, to follow those commandments just like He did the nation of Israel. We aren't exempt because we're under grace. In fact, in a lot of ways, the bar is higher because God's called us to greater things, to more important things. And so He wants us to live up to those expectations that He's placed upon us. The idea there mentioned in verse 5 that it says that they shall have life or they shall live, really speaks of fullness of life, right? That you will live a blessed life, that you will live a life in God's favor if you follow His commandments. And so it's not just saying you won't die, it's saying that there will be a fullness in your life, that you will live a blessed life. Now verse 6 introduces the beginnings of these restrictions on the behavior of the Israelites that's described in further detail in the following verses. Verse 6 says, none of you shall approach to any that is near kin to him to uncover their nakedness. I am the Lord. And since this type of interaction is already forbidden in the Ten Commandments, particularly the seventh that says, thou shalt not commit adultery, anything listed in the following verses here really is a breach of that law, but also it addresses the issue of marriage and who it's appropriate to marry and who it's not appropriate to marry, because ultimately the kind of relationship that we're talking about here is that marriage relationship. Okay, and so if it was just that they were engaging in this outside of marriage, it would already be wrong. There wouldn't be any need to really go into much more detail as it's done here. But what's spoken of here, because we know when you say this is wrong, the first thing that people do is try to find a loophole. Well, the first thing they do is say, well, who are you to tell me what's wrong? The second thing they do is try to find a loophole, right? How can I get around this rule? How can I keep from following this commandment? And find some kind of loophole that may exist. And so God goes into explanation about what's appropriate and not appropriate, because you could say, well, if I marry this person, then it's okay, right? Well, God's saying, well, here's people that it's not okay to marry. And here's a situation where it's not fitting. And clearly He says, well, those who are near of kin to you, it's not appropriate to marry and have those kind of relationships with them. And so again, what's the natural tendency? Well, what does that mean exactly? What is near? What qualifies there? And so the next several verses go into a pretty lengthy list about what's near, what's considered off limits when it comes to marital relationships. So we're going to go through them. I'll pause at a few of them and explain things that may be a little unclear. But for the most part, we're just going to read through them like we did a couple of chapters ago, because this is something that I don't want to go into a lot of detail over. So verses 7 and 8 says, the nakedness of thy father or the nakedness of thy mother thou shalt not uncover. She is thy mother, and thou shalt not uncover her nakedness. The nakedness of thy father's wife thou shalt not uncover. It is thy father's nakedness. And I'll pause there for just a moment. That would be a wife that isn't your mother. Okay, and so it's saying that you shouldn't have any relationship with her. But not only that, we see here kind of introduce something that we see a couple more times throughout this passage, and that is that the marriage relationship really makes the two one flesh. You know, that's what God said when He put Adam and Eve together, right? The two shall become one flesh. Jesus talked about that in the New Testament, referring to marriage. The two become one. And that's what's talked about here, where it says, it is thy father's nakedness. Okay? He is hers, she is his. They are one. And we see that happen a few more times. And so to uncover the one would be the same or equal to that of the other. And so it's forbidden as if it had been father and mother, by blood. Picking up in verse 9, it says, the nakedness of thy sister, the daughter of thy father, or the daughter of thy mother, whether she be born at home or born abroad, even their nakedness shalt thou not uncover. The home or abroad probably has to do with legitimate or illegitimate children. It doesn't matter that one way or the other, however the child came into into being, this was forbidden, siblings. Verse 10 said, the nakedness of thy son's daughter or thy daughter's daughter, even their nakedness thou shalt not uncover, for theirs is thine own nakedness. The nakedness of thy father's wife's daughter, begotten of thy father, she is thy sister. Thou shalt not uncover her nakedness. Verse 12, thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy father's sister. She is thy father's near kinswoman. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy father or thy mother's sister, for she is thy mother's near kinswoman. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy father's brother. Thou shalt not approach to his wife. She is thine aunt. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy daughter-in-law. She is thy son's wife. Thou shalt not uncover her nakedness. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy brother's wife. It is thy brother's nakedness. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of the woman and her daughter. Neither shalt thou take her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter to uncover her nakedness, for they are her near kinswomen. It is wickedness. The relation there prohibits from marrying a woman and then engaging in any kind of activities with daughter or granddaughter. Again, we look at all this and we think, well, that's gross anyway, right? But this was not uncommon in the cultures that they were dwelling among, that they would be dwelling among. And so he lays all these things out. Also, this kind of reminds us that once that bond is made, even though blood kin may not qualify as far as the daughter goes, once the relationship between the husband and wife is there, then they are one flesh. And so what's forbidden in the one case would also be forbidden in the other. Verse 18 says, neither shalt thou take a wife to her sister to vex her, to uncover her nakedness beside the other in her lifetime. And so don't have sister wives, right? Don't do that. And the Israelites can look at their history and see an example of how that didn't work out too well, right? If you go back to Jacob, he married Rachel and Leah, and did they ever get along after that? Now, I don't know if they got along before that, maybe they didn't, but we certainly know that after those marriages, they didn't get along. They fought, and that passed on to the children, right? And that's how Joseph ended up in slavery and all that, was because of that situation that had developed. So that was off limits and not acceptable. Now, again, we can raise the question, well, isn't polygamy wrong anyway? Yes. Now, it's not addressed specifically in this passage, but I think the lesson we find from Scripture, even in the Old Testament where it was fairly common, is that it wasn't preferred and it rarely worked out well. It just simply wasn't the case. That's why God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Eve and a few others, right? One to one. One husband, one wife is the plan that God has. Verse 19 ties back to the law about ceremonial uncleanness. Verse 18 is kind of where it stops about the near kinspeople. Verse 19 says, also, thou shalt not approach unto a woman to uncover her nakedness as long as she is put apart for her uncleanness. And so that we covered that a few weeks ago, and that's just repetition of that forbidding of that interaction there. Verse 20 is basically restating the 7th commandment that I mentioned earlier. Thou shalt not commit adultery, verse 20. Moreover, thou shalt not lie carnally with thy neighbor's wife to defile thyself with her. It is worth noting that there's defiling going on for both. It's not just, it's one person's fault or the other person's fault. Both people are guilty in adulterous relationships, and so the man, along with the woman, would be included in the guilt there. Verse 21 dealt with another practice that we look on as completely horrible and yet was occurring in Canaan at the time and would also happen among the children of Israel later on in their history. Verse 21, and thou shalt not let any of thy seed pass through the fire to Molech, neither shalt thou profane the name of the Lord, or the name of thy God. I am the Lord. This is basically what it sounds like, children being offered to sacrifices as sacrifices to these false gods. Some look at that and say the fire there is italicized. That means that those words were added to help clarification. And so they say that shouldn't be there. This is only dedicating your children to these false gods, which either way, it's an abomination, right? Either way, it's an offense to God. It's horribly wrong. The reality is that we know that later on in the history of Israel, whether this is speaking specifically about offering children as sacrifices or not, we know that that did come into practice in Israel among God's people. Over in 2 Chronicles chapter 28 verse 3, it says very specifically that they did this, that they burned their children to these false gods. And we look at that and say, well, how could a nation get to that point, right? How could it be so vile? How could it be so wicked? How could it be so evil to do these things? But then we have to pause and look at the mirror and think about our nation and the countless number of babies who've been sacrificed, not to some god, but basically to convenience, and saying that it's okay. It's not. We are just as guilty of this practice as the nation of Israel was. And so, when you pause and think about that, it really causes concern, I think, or it should cause concern for us about our nation, especially as we get down and we read toward the end when it talks about how these are some of the things that are the reason that God led Israel to go drive the Canaanites out, because they were engaged in these practices that are so horrible that we look at in that way. Verse 22, we come to another sin that, again, has become very accepted and applauded in our culture. Verse 22, thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is an abomination. I'm not sure, you hear a lot of people say, well, the Bible doesn't say anything about homosexuality. I don't know how they can say that, because there's no question about what's being talked about here. That's exactly what's at issue here. And it says very clearly, it is an abomination to God. It is not okay. It is not right in any form or fashion. And again, we need to realize that the more we abandon God's morality, the more we abandon these kind of regulations and rules. And again, I know we're not under the law, but this is about what's right and wrong, what's sinful and not sinful. And the more that we, as a nation, get out from under that and get away from that, the more all these other things become more and more acceptable. And some of them we look at and say, well, that's just horrid and it can never be the case. But 20 years ago, some of the things that are common now, we would look at and say, well, that's horrid and it can never be the case. And so we've got to really pray for our country and pray for our nation that it would turn and be what God would have it to be, because we know the judgment that comes when nations, God deals with nations just like he does with individuals. When nations rebel and reject God's standards, then consequences do arise. Verse 23 finishes up the list with another vile behavior, and that's followed by the answer to a question a lot of people do have about the conquering of the promised land. Verse 23, neither shalt thou lie with any beast to defile thyself therewith, neither shalt any woman stand before a beast to lie down thereto. It is confusion. Defile not ye yourselves in any of these things, for in all these things the nations are defiled, which I cast out before you. And the land is defiled, therefore I do not visit the iniquity thereof upon it. I do visit the iniquity thereof upon it, and the land itself vomiteth out her inhabitants. So this explains, this is why. People often ask, well, how could God tell Israel to go out and drive these people out and slaughter, thousands and thousands of people? How could he tell them to wipe them all out and not leave any alive? And this is part of the answer to that. Because of their wickedness, because of their behavior, because of the acts that they were involved in and things that they were doing. Because, again, we read through this list, and some of it we just look at and we shake our heads, and it's hard to even imagine. It's uncomfortable to read through the list, because of how gross it is to us. And yet, it was common practice in some areas in some of those nations. And so they were driven out for a reason, because of their wickedness, because of their sin, because of not only these things, many others. God was righteous in doing this. God wasn't mean-spirited and hateful or anything like that. He was righteous in doing these things. And so, again, we have to consider that in terms of ourselves, in terms of our nation, about, what's our standing before God, and when is judgment going to come for us if we don't turn back to him. And that's something, again, we need to pray about, and we really need to seek God's face. Verses 26 through 30, the rest of the chapter basically warns Israel that they're not exempt from judgment if they follow the example of the Canaanites here. Verse 26, ye shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not commit any of these abominations, neither any of your own nation, nor any stranger that sojourneth among you. For all these abominations have the men of the land done, which were before you, and the land is defiled, that the land spew you not out also when ye defile it, as it spewed out the nations that were before you. For whosoever shall commit any of these abominations, even the souls that commit them, shall be cut off from among their people. Therefore shall ye keep mine ordinances, that ye commit not any one of these abominable customs which were committed before you, that ye defile not yourselves therein. I am the Lord your God. So here he includes, again, the sojourners, as we saw this in the previous chapter, those who were among the camp at this time period. Later on, of course, part of the nation of Israel, or within the borders of the nation of Israel, they were to follow the same rules. They were not to engage in these practices just like the Israelites weren't to. You couldn't say, well, that's not my custom where I'm from. If you were in Israel, you were to follow Israel's customs. You were to do things the way that God commanded them to be done, and you were to avoid the things that God had forbidden. And we also see here kind of that dual responsibility that we have as individuals, but also as a nation. As a nation, the danger was that they would be driven out, that they would be spewed out just like the nations before them. God says, look, don't think just because I chose you, just don't think just because I delivered you out of Egypt that you're exempt from judgment, that you have a free pass to do whatever you want. That's simply not the case. I've given you the commandments. I've given you the instructions. And so really you're held to a higher standard because you have the opportunity to know them. You have me speaking these words to you. You have my man leading you to this place. And so they had no excuse. And he told them, look, if you go in and you do these things, you can expect the same results. Now, they did eventually go in and do some of the same things. And to a degree, they had the same result, right? They weren't completely wiped out like most of the Canaanite nations were, but they were scattered into captivity. And the vast majority of them were driven out of Israel. And so God kept his promise. God wasn't unfair. Again, was it unfair for him to drive out the Canaanites and let Israel have the land? No. Because when Israel did the same thing, he drove them out too. And another group had the land for a time period. And so God is consistent, and God is righteous, and we can trust in that. And then, of course, it ends up like it began, basically, I am the Lord your God. I have the right to declare these things. I have the right to say what's right and what's wrong. And God is still God. He is still Jehovah. He is still the Lord. And whether he is your God or not, whether you acknowledge him or not, really doesn't change the fact that he is God. And so God is the one who gets to say what's right and wrong. So whenever somebody asks, who gives you the right? I don't have the right. God has the right. And here's what God says. And that's what we have to stand on. Next week, we'll continue with more laws guiding the relationships of God's people, particularly with himself, as well as with their neighbors. And we come to a passage that I think everybody's probably familiar with about, loving your neighbor, which is something that sounds very New Testament-y, but it's also under the law. So, any questions or comments?